Have you ever believed in something so deeply that it felt like the ground beneath you was solid, only for a single moment, a single breath, a single unexpected encounter to shatter everything you thought you knew? It is terrifying when life forces you to question the beliefs that were once the pillars of your identity. And it becomes even more unsettling when the source of that transformation comes from a place the world often overlooks, misunderstands, or quietly underestimates. For years, people have spoken, sometimes loudly, sometimes in whispers, about the Philippines, as if they already agreed on a certain story. It is poor. It is chaotic. It is dangerous. It is spiritually confused. These phrases drift across social media, across foreign news channels, across half-informed conversations in cafes and airports. And after a while, you begin to feel as though there is an illusion of consensus, as if the entire world has already decided what the Philippines is allowed to be. I once heard a European lecturer, an elderly man admired in the academic world, say in a conference room filled with applause, "Faith is dying in most developing countries. Superstition replaces spirituality." People nodded. They took notes. His words became a kind of accepted truth, a truth unquestioned. But what if I told you that months later, that same man would stand in silence on a dimly lit street in Manila, watching something so profoundly human, so deeply spiritual, that he whispered, "I was wrong." And what if I told you he wasn't even the most surprising story? Because somewhere far from that lecture hall, in a small apartment outside Tehran, a young Iranian man was slowly losing himself. His name was Arash. And long before he ever set foot on Filipino soil, his life had already started cracking in places he could no longer patch together. He grew up in a world where faith was not a choice, but an inheritance. A world where belief was carved into identity, where questioning was dangerous, and where silence was safer than truth. From childhood, he was taught who God should be, how he must be worshipped, and how obedience defined holiness. But as he became older, as the world around him darkened with conflicts and contradictions, something in him began to fracture. He saw rules without compassion. He witnessed rituals without warmth. He heard sermons that echoed like commands, not conversations. And slowly, quietly, he lost the ability to believe. There was an illness he ignored for years, not only of the body but of the heart. Depression crept in. Anxiety followed. He began waking up with a heaviness he could not name. The political tension, the economic strain, the lack of personal freedom, everything placed a weight on him that he could no longer carry. Yet he kept going, not living but enduring. One night, after a particularly tense argument with relatives who insisted he was weak in faith, Arash stared at the ceiling of his room and whispered, "If God is here, why do I feel so alone?" It was the first truly honest prayer he had offered in years. He tried searching for answers outside his country, online forums, foreign friends, language exchange communities. But nothing changed. Nothing lifted the emptiness. Nothing silenced the ache. Until one day he stumbled upon a video posted by a Filipino nurse working in Kuwait. She spoke softly, not preaching, not debating, not arguing. She simply told a story about a patient who survived because the hospital chapel prayed for him relentlessly. And at the end of the video, she smiled, a gentle smile, warm and unforced, and said, "In the Philippines, faith is not forced. It is felt." For reasons he could not understand, that line unsettled him. It stayed with him. It echoed days later. It bothered him, in a strange, comforting way, because it contradicted everything he had been taught. Faith. Felt? Arash never planned to leave Iran. People often imagine that great transformations begin with courage, but more often they begin with exhaustion, the kind that sinks so deep you no longer recognize your own reflection. He had reached that point. His illness, once something he brushed aside as just stress, grew into a constant dull pain across his chest, a weight that made even breathing feel like a task. The hospitals near his home had kind, capable doctors, but the system was overburdened, under-equipped, and painfully slow. Weeks turned into months before he could even get proper tests done. By then, the pain had spread to his back, his shoulders, his sleep. There were nights when the power went out during government curfews, and he lay in darkness, listening to the distant echoes of conflict in neighboring streets. In those moments, hope felt like a foreign word. He told no one, not his family, not his friends, not the people who believed he was simply disconnected from God. He buried it all, hiding his pain like a secret scar. He tried looking outward, toward the West. The places he had always heard were filled with opportunity. He dreamed of America, where he imagined he could start over. But the embassy lines were impossible, the documents expensive, and every rejection felt like a quiet reminder that the world was closing its doors. Japan intrigued him, its calm, its order, but he quickly discovered how strict their immigration policies were. Europe seemed hopeful, but even there, he could sense the walls tightening, especially against those from the Middle East. Every path he tried was blocked. And each disappointment carved deeper cracks into his spirit. One afternoon, he watched a documentary about refugees crossing borders with nothing but fear in their eyes. For a moment, he saw himself in them. Not fleeing war, but fleeing a life that felt smaller and darker each year. He turned off the TV and sat in silence, asking himself a question he had avoided for too long. Where can a man rediscover himself? No answer came. Then, unexpectedly, a tiny spark reappeared from the most unlikely place, a Filipino acquaintance from an online language group. Her name was Lyra. She lived in Manila, working part-time as a caregiver and studying psychology. She was ordinary, simple, not wealthy, not influential, but something about her presence struck Arash. She radiated calm. Even through a computer screen, she carried a gentleness he rarely encountered. He told her about his unexplained pain, his anxiety, his frustration with doctors, and she listened without interruption, without judgment. When he apologized for bothering her with problems, she smiled and typed back, "It's not a bother. You deserve to be heard." No one had ever said that to him. Over the weeks that followed, she introduced him to fragments of Filipino life, photos of their parish church, stories of neighbors helping neighbors during typhoons, videos of students singing worship songs with unfiltered joy. She never tried to convert him, never invited him to church, never pressured him to believe anything. She simply shared what was normal for her, a world where faith lived in everyday acts of kindness. Arash couldn't quite understand why these simple exchanges began softening something inside him. He was still guarded, still skeptical, still carrying years of spiritual bruises. Yet he found himself waiting for their conversations. When he spoke, she listened. When he doubted, she didn't argue. She asked questions that made him think. When he told her he no longer felt connected to God, she replied, "Maybe God is waiting for you somewhere unexpected." It wasn't a religious phrase. It felt more like a hand extended in the dark. Then came the turning point, the moment that pushed him beyond hesitation. His condition worsened. One evening, he collapsed in his room, the pain piercing through his ribs. When he finally recovered enough to message Lyra, she insisted gently but firmly, "You need proper treatment. Go somewhere safe. Go somewhere with people who care." She then sent him a list of hospitals in the Philippines, including the one where she volunteered. "If you come here," she wrote, You won't be alone." The words lingered long after he closed the chat. He had never imagined the Philippines as an option. It was a nation he knew almost nothing about, a distant archipelago, a place his friends dismissed as poor or unstable, a country rarely discussed. The airport in Manila was louder than anything Arash had imagined. As he stepped out of the arrival gate, the warm air hit him first, thick, humid, alive. Then came the sounds, conversations in English and Tagalog, the rhythmic shuffle of luggage wheels, the chorus of tricycle horns drifting in from the streets beyond. He felt overwhelmed, but strangely, not frightened. There was a softness here, an energy that wrapped around him like a gentle welcome. He scanned the crowd, unsure of what he was looking for, until he noticed a small woman waving timidly from near the exit. Lyra. She was shorter than he expected, wearing simple clothes and holding a paper cup of iced coffee for him. When he approached, she offered it shyly and said, "You must be tired. Welcome to the Philippines." Her smile, the same one he had seen dozens of times on video calls, held the same warmth in person, but now it carried something deeper. Sincerity. They rode through the traffic of Manila, a chaotic dance of jeepneys, motorcycles, and buses moving with a rhythm he couldn't decipher. People often say Manila is noisy, messy, crowded. But from the window of that car, Arash saw something else. He saw street vendors laughing with customers, children waving at strangers, a group of teens carrying a statue of the Santo Niño as they crossed an intersection, smiling as though the world itself was light. It was nothing like the cold cities he had visited before, where people hurried past one another without a glance. Here, even the chaos felt human. When they arrived at the hospital, he expected the usual routine: stern faces, impatient voices, long lines of people waiting for help. But instead he found something he could only describe as unexpected tenderness. A nurse with kind eyes guided him to a seat and asked softly, "Sir Arash, do you need water? Are you okay to walk?" Her voice carried concern, not obligation. Even when she checked his vitals, she placed her hand on his arm for a brief moment of reassurance, as if letting him know he wasn't alone. Later, as he lay on the hospital bed awaiting tests, he heard singing from the hallway. Gentle, worshipful voices. At first he assumed it was a radio, but soon he realized it was the staff, nurses, interns, technicians, gathered in a small chapel beside the ward, singing during their break. Their harmonies were simple, pure, almost fragile. He closed his eyes, not understanding the lyrics, but feeling the emotion behind them as clearly as if someone had placed a warm hand on his chest. When the doctor entered, a middle-aged man with calm eyes, he introduced himself and said, "Here, we treat not just the illness, but the person living with it." The words stunned Arash. No doctor had ever spoken to him that way. They reviewed his tests together, and the doctor explained every detail with patience, pausing often to ask if he had questions. It wasn't just professionalism. It was care. Over the next few days, something began to shift. Each morning, a nurse would greet him as if they were old friends. A cleaner would pause to ask if he had slept well. Even the guard outside the ward would nod respectfully whenever he passed. These small gestures, meaningless in many places, felt monumental to a man who had spent years feeling invisible. One evening, Lyra visited him after her classes. She brought him arroz caldo, the warm Filipino rice porridge her mother made whenever someone at home was sick. As he ate, a light rain began tapping against the windows. "Filipinos believe rain can be a blessing," she told him casually. "A reminder that even storms bring life." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched the droplets slide down the glass, each one catching the glow of the city lights. For the first time in years, he felt something loosen in his chest, something he wasn't ready to name but could no longer deny. It was not joy. Not yet. But it was the first quiet release of a pain he had carried for far too long. The contrast with his past was startling. He remembered the hospitals back home. The hurried steps, the indifferent faces, the suspicion that followed him whenever he expressed doubt or fear. He remembered the coldness of clinics abroad, where he had been another file, another number. Here, he was treated like a person, with dignity, with patience, with humanity. And slowly, almost reluctantly, a question began to form in his heart, tugging at him with gentle persistence. Why do these people care so much? He didn't know the answer. Not yet. But he sensed that he was standing at the threshold of something larger than treatment. Arash didn't realize when the shift truly began. It wasn't a dramatic moment, not a sudden miracle, not a moment of thunder or revelation. Instead, it was the accumulation of small, gentle things, the kind that go unnoticed until they suddenly rise inside you, like a tide that has been quietly gathering strength. By his second week in Manila, he found himself waking up not with dread, but with curiosity. He watched the morning sun filter through the half-open blinds of his hospital room, painting soft lines of gold across the floor. Nurses moved through the corridors with unhurried steps, greeting each patient with a warmth that seemed almost instinctive. The smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted in from the nurses' station, mixing with the clean scent of disinfectant. It was a strange combination, but somehow comforting. One morning, after a routine checkup, he joined Lyra in the small hospital chapel. She had invited him once before, but he politely declined. That day, however, something nudged him. Not obligation, not curiosity alone, but a quiet desire to understand what made this place feel so different. He stepped inside cautiously, half expecting to feel out of place. Instead, he found a room filled with silence, soft enough to breathe. A dozen people were there, staff in scrubs, visitors with tired eyes, an elderly man holding a rosary. No one looked up when he entered. There was no pressure, no expectation, no rigid doctrine being recited. Just people kneeling or sitting, whispering their hearts into the stillness. Lyra sat at the back and simply closed her eyes. Arash didn't pray. He didn't know how to, not in this way. But he sat beside her, listening to the soft hum of devotion around him. And for the first time in years, he felt something familiar yet forgotten. The sensation of being held, not by a doctrine or a rule, but by something invisible and gentle, something that felt like peace. When they walked out, he didn't speak for a long while. Lyra didn't ask questions. She simply walked beside him, her hands clasped behind her back, the way she always did when she sensed he was processing something profound. As days passed, he began to spend more time outside his room. He sat in the lobby watching families gather around their sick loved ones, offering smiles even through exhaustion. He observed janitors pausing to make playful faces at children crying over injections. He watched doctors stop in hallways to comfort anxious relatives. He saw strangers holding the elevator for one another even during peak hours, and he noticed something he had never seen in any hospital abroad: small pockets of joy quietly unfolding amid suffering. One evening, after a particularly emotional conversation with his doctor about the progress of his treatment, Arash stepped outside the hospital for fresh air. Rain had just ended. The pavement shimmered under the glow of nearby lamp posts. A group of hospital staff gathered near the entrance, laughing softly as they shared snacks. One of them waved at him. "Sir Arash, try this," she said, handing him a piece of warm bibinka wrapped in banana leaf. The sweetness melted on his tongue, mixing with the warmth of the moment in a way that made his eyes sting. A simple gesture. But for him, it was the crack in the shell he had built around his heart. Later that night, he found himself standing on the rooftop garden, looking over the sprawling city lights of Manila. The sky above was a deep blue, dotted with stars fighting to shine through the haze. He felt a strange swell inside his chest. Not pain, not anxiety, but emotion so unfamiliar he didn't know whether to cry or breathe deeply. A thought rose from the quietest part of him, uninvited but undeniable. I have never seen this anywhere else. He said it out loud. The words trembled in the air, fragile and honest. The next day, after another chapel visit, he told Lyra something he hadn't said to anyone. Back home, faith felt like pressure. Here, it feels like presence. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at him with eyes that glimmered with both empathy and pride. That's because Filipinos don't force God, she whispered. We walk with him. It was then, in that simple, unadorned moment, that he realized something inside him had begun to heal long before his body did. He didn't need visions or miracles. He only needed humanity. The kind he had found here, in a place he once never considered, among people who had given him more than care. They had given him belonging. By the time Arash completed his treatment, he no longer walked through the hospital corridors with the guarded heaviness he once carried. His steps were steadier, his shoulders lighter, his eyes no longer dimmed by that old, unspoken fear. The pain in his body had lessened, but the greater healing, the one he never expected, the one he didn't even know he needed, had taken place quietly inside him over those weeks in Manila. Something had shifted so completely that even he struggled to recognize the man he had been when he first arrived. On his last morning at the hospital, he stood outside the chapel one more time. The door was slightly open. Inside, a single nurse knelt with her head bowed, whispering a prayer before starting her shift. He didn't want to disturb her, so he simply watched for a moment. The scene was simple, almost ordinary, yet he felt his throat tighten. He remembered how faith once made him feel trapped, how it was tied to rules, scrutiny, fear. But here he saw something entirely different. Faith that breathed, faith that embraced, faith that comforted without demanding, faith that lived in gestures, not threats. He stepped back, placed his hand gently against the wooden frame of the chapel door, and whispered, almost without thinking, "Thank you." He wasn't addressing the nurse. He wasn't addressing the room. He wasn't even certain who he was speaking to. But the sincerity in those two quiet words told him everything. He was no longer the man who had once doubted if God could hear him. Outside the hospital, Lyra waited with him for the taxi that would take him to the apartment he had chosen to rent for a month before returning home. "You look different," she said softly as they stood under a warm Manila sun. "Stronger." He laughed, surprised by the ease of it. "I feel different," he admitted. "It's like I came here to heal my body, but what healed first was something I didn't realize was broken." They shared a quiet pause, watching people pass, students rushing to class, mothers carrying groceries, a group of construction workers joking loudly as they walked. Life moved with the same chaotic rhythm as always, but to Arash, it all seemed gentler now, warmer, as though the entire world had changed, when in truth, it was he who had changed. Days later, he visited a small parish church near his apartment. He didn't go to convert. He didn't go to follow a ritual. He simply went because something inside him felt drawn to the peace he had found in the chapel at the hospital. The church was open air, filled with wooden pews and the soft scent of candles. Children played outside, while elderly women prayed with rosaries wrapped gently around their fingers. A choir practiced in the corner, their voices rising like sunlight through stained glass. He sat in the back, watching, observing, absorbing. And as he listened to the choir's harmonies, he felt a tear slip quietly down his cheek. Not from sorrow, from recognition, from gratitude, from the profound realization that he had found something he thought he had lost forever, the ability to believe not because he was told to, but because he felt truth living in the kindness around him. When he returned to Iran months later, his family noticed the change immediately. "You're calmer," his mother whispered one night, touching his face the way she did when he was a child. "Something is different in your eyes." Arash didn't know how to explain it in simple words, so he told her about the people, the smiles, the gentle prayers, the doctors who treated him like a friend, the nurses who cared for him like a brother, the strangers who offered help without expecting anything in return. He told her, "If goodness has a place, I think I found it." For the rest of his life, he would carry the Philippines with him, not as a destination, not as a temporary refuge, but as the place where his faith, his hope, and his humanity were restored. A country that showed him God not through walls or rituals, but through love in its simplest and purest forms. And so his story stretches far beyond one man's transformation. It carries a message that reaches anyone who has ever doubted, ever felt alone, ever wondered if kindness still exists in a world full of noise and conflict. Because in a world divided by ideology, wounded by war, exhausted by uncertainty, there remains a place that continues to shine with a rare kind of light. A place where compassion isn't a performance, where faith isn't a weapon, where hope is not a theory, but a daily practice lived by millions. The Philippines. A nation that, in its warmth, restored a man's belief in God. A people whose kindness reminded him that humanity is still beautiful. And a story that whispers to every heart that needs healing. Sometimes, the place you never expected is the one that saves you.